Gonna start welcoming you. Welcome everybody. This is first day, second slot, one of the two sessions on the term neighborhood. And I think it's great that the papers all deal with that quite directly. We're gonna start with Gaia, who's actually talking about neighborhood. Then Karen, who will be talking about neighbors, so people as opposed to a place, or more particularly people. Then Valentin and Chiara will explore commoning, but also through related to how we conceive of the neighborhood as a place. And Vanessa will end with a reflection on Mutirão and the origins of the term, which is now much used. She will be looking at the sort of the origins of that term. So I'm going to try to do what I'm supposed to do, which is play Gaia's video. Let me know if that works.
My paper investigates the construction and evolution of the notion of neighborhood within the architectural thinking, looking at its changing meaning between the 30s and 50s, when the concept was transferred from other domains into the architectural knowledge, influencing discourses and practices of architects. A foundational concept in social sciences and planning culture, neighborhood is an equivocal term, a contradictory notion that appears as a timeless phenomenon, ambiguous in its shifting between a material concept and an abstract term, in its changing significance in diverse situations and usages, languages, fields of knowledge, lexicon and jargons, from the normative language of technical planning to the political usage, to the languages of real estate market, or the one of social scientists and administrative bodies, to its common usage by citizens and activists, sometimes used to define administrative boundaries or systems of relation. Neighborhood unit as a paradigm of physical planning originated from the translation from social sciences to modernist planning, and from social indicators to the well-known spatial model conceived by Clarence Perry, has been widely investigated. Neighbor unit acquired stability as an organizational structure in its many adaptations, becoming a technique of measurement massively applied to modern housing estates in the frame of post-war reconstruction. The aim of the paper is not to reiterate the genealogy of the neighbor unit or to investigate the etymological aspects, but rather to understand the processes of appropriation and adaptation in the discourses and practice of architects when crystallized as a design tool and method started to be used to designate new space. The research introduced three trajectories to look at the shifting significance of the concept in response to specific political and economic changes, analyzing the process of transfer, assimilation of the idea, but also the forms of resistance, translation, misunderstanding, generated by its circulation across cultures and languages. First, from early century New York social reform to the New Deal public housing program. Second, the affirmation of the concept in American architectural arena during World War II, and then its post-war transatlantic dissemination into the discourses and practice of post-war European reconstruction that show the tension between its universal value and its relative and localized meaning. A first trajectory that I only introduced today observed a first shifts from New York settlement works to the New Deal official discourse of public housing, when the informal notion used by early century activists and social reformers to express social needs and aspirations of the community acquired a normative value, translated in operative tools for the design and measuring of facilities in the frame of federal housing programs. Neighborhood was an informal concept in the philanthropic agenda of social reformers who, through the neighborhood houses, spaces for the community activities, anticipated the debate on neighborhood design without conferring to the notion a spatial connotation. However, crucial concepts originated in the culture of settlement work, like municipal housekeeping and voluntary public works, contributing to establish a field of study, introducing the idea of measuring the social needs and defining tools to improve living conditions in the neighborhood, proposing guidelines and principles for its dimensioning. However, the romantic discourse on neighborhood found an expression in an institutionalized urban governance and practice, the public housing, through governmental interventions, contributing to the approval of a national program and of specific principles for the design of neighborhood. The codification and formalization of needs and aspirations took place when transferred on the institutional ground, becoming a focal point of federal programs translated into languages, standards, and codes that normed the relation between housing and facilities, their dimensioning and design, to define the number of playgrounds, public baths, social centers, and the scale of the neighborhood. That became not only centers for leisure, but also occasions for the architectural research. Federal departments like the Public Recreation Committee reframed the reforms of early century also through demonstration programs and manifesto projects that became sites of experimentation and codification of these ideas of neighborhood design in the frame of the new slum clearance plan. The second trajectory addressed the war as a laboratory. In his 1943 documentary, Can Neighborhood Exist?, proposed for the Better Philadelphia exhibition of 1947, the architect Oscar Stonorow described the new significance that the notion of neighborhood assumed as a response to the new cultural instances of the war as the natural and logic unit of the post-war social structure based on community life. While neighborhood design emerged as a transnational phenomenon after World War II in the frame of reconstruction programs, the war years offer a fertile ground for the reconceptualization of the neighborhood discourse. An intense debate on neighborhood design and community planning that calibrate urban structure to the human scale started to emerge as a way to return to organic communities, and neighborhood moved from being conceived as a political and social concept to a design tool, method, and value, becoming an occasion also to rethink post-war architecture and planning culture. The neighborhood-oriented design approach introduced a new transcalar perspective. The sociological notion of neighborhood as intermediate entity between the individual and the state was translated as the intermediate unit between the house and the city, and neighborhood became the field of action of architects during the war, establishing a new system that coordinated local action and city planning. But neighborhood also emerged as an occasion to rebuild the discipline, reorganize the professional practice, introducing new professional roles and forms of cooperation imposed by the war that encouraged the cooperative structure. Experienced in the frame of war housing commissions, neighborhood design highlighted the changing role of professionals involved in housing provision and the emergence of a new discourse on the architect planner involved in neighborhood design, where disciplinary boundaries seems to disappear. Finally, a new idea of democratic participation and the involvement of inhabitants, families, and social entities in the design of modern communities and neighborhoods introduce inedited forms of participation that anticipate the post-war practices and experiences of advocacy planning. In the frame of the discursive context of humanizing the city embedded in the war in reaction to ongoing processes of urban renewal and suburbanization, the discourse on neighborhood and on the design of new human settlements convey also new forms of criticism of modernity. In his Human Scale in City Planning, José Luis Serre translated this search for a human scale from a metaphor into a scheme, portraying human scale as a model in democracy, breaking the city in well-defined units composed of the modern city. He used anthropometrical categories based on the human body, supplemented by understanding of the human scale, naturalizing the scale of the neighborhood, reframing the geometrical approximation of Vitruvius Man by Leonardo to define an abstract scheme of neighborhood organized around a community center like cells in an organism representing the individual needs in the social body. He introduced the new imageries for the organization of communities. Translated in a special model, the discourse showed the adaptation of the space to the everyday family life as a basis of a new social organism where the size of township was limited by pedestrian range to keep within human scale. Like Ropius, Serre's proposal highlighted the shifting significance of neighborhood from quantitative agglomeration into living delimited organism adapted to the life cycle of the family. Publication, exhibition contribute to the construction of a new discourse on neighborhood design and community planning during the war, with the participation of architects, planners, governmental institutions, and cultural centers. Between 1940 and 1945, River, Copper, and Brass published a series of booklets devoted to After Victory, neighborhood and community planning, authored by leading architects who assumed the role of educators of a general audience, proposing guidelines and principles for neighborhood design. Why City Planning is Your Responsibility, published in 1942 by Oscar Stoner and Louis Kahn, proposed new strategies to convert a neighborhood in a modern community organized in 6 city blocks around the central commercial area, as a model for the rehabilitation of typical middle-class neighborhood through the collaboration between local industry, public action, technicians, and citizens, defining a procedure that regulates the relation between the family, the community, and the city. However, it was in 1944, through the publication of their You and Your Neighborhood, a primer for community planning and neighborhood design, that the two architects proposed a real primer for neighborhood design, conceptualizing ideas and material coming from diverse experiences, like the plan for Radbourne or Sert's chart showing the need of inhabitants of different ages, published in his Can Our City Survive? The primer proposed the neighborhood as a unit to design human settlements based on a system of 6 townships organized in 8 neighborhoods. Rooted in Stoner's interest in political activism and modern architecture and in his involvement in the design of union-sponsored public housing, the booklet proposed also a set of tools, techniques, 3D models, wooden blocks, collage, 3D maps for inhabitants to express their needs and contribute to the planning and design of their neighborhoods, defining procedures for citizen groups that will be fitted in the master plan. The booklet proposed also to regulate the collaboration between inhabitants and designers, and between architects, private developers, and public enterprise involved in the implementation of facilities and services based on the needs of the neighborhood and of the communities formed by 15 neighborhoods that introduce facility at a diverse scale, sports fields, library, auditorium. The neighborhood discourse found a first application in the fence housing program inaugurated by federal agency that used neighborhood as a design unit to experiment alternative forms of professional practice in the frame of housing commissions that mirrored the synthesis between landscape design, community planning, and mass housing architecture. In addition, the fence housing allowed also to test new forms of participation of workers that gradually entered in the strategies of both private developers and federal agencies for the design of urban housing estates, conceived at a new scale with the participation of workers and through the interaction between the state, the market, the designers, and policymakers, introduced a new attention for the design of a core of community facilities, also by speculative builders, as an additional value in their strategies, sales strategies. These values materialized also in the unpublished schemes produced by Louis Kahn in the same years for a workable and human guide for the design of an integrated community for workers that show the fence housing as the ideal ground for architects to synthesize in the principles of neighborhood organization what he defined the redemptive power of modern architecture and the ideology of planned community. He aims at humanly and technically experiment in the design of modern settlements for a community of 10,000 families, the integration of static human elements and experimental technique with middle-class test and living habit in 12 neighborhoods. The growing attention for the research on neighborhood in the architectural field is confirmed also by the special issues that Architectural Forum published in October 1943, aimed at anticipating visions for projected post-war neighborhoods. The attention moved from the design of the individual building to the new scale of the integrated and organized neighborhood, conceived with the involvement of inhabitants, and from a system based on individual property to new large-scale operation of community planning, conceived through the cooperation among architects, planners, banks, insurance companies, developers, and constructors. The same Museum of Modern Art of New York displayed in his wartime exhibition neighborhood design as a form of resistance to urban sprawl and urban renewal, insisting on the necessity to provide community facilities at cooperative or municipal forms. In particular, to the neighbor revitalization based on community participation is dedicated the exhibition Look at Your Neighborhood, held by the museum in 1944 in collaboration with the United States Housing Authority and designed by Rudolf Mack and Charles Dane, that proposed through photographs, drawings, maps, diagrams, and schemes a set of principles for democratic planning of good neighborhood for the design of post-war environment based on the needs of citizens, families, and communities involved in its design. design. The exhibition referred to contemporary neighborhood regeneration experiments like the one in Baltimore and cross-war research on the regenerative forces of neighborhood as a unit of manageable size and the cell from which the city grows, used also to regenerate existing urban sectors at the intermediate scale of the community. Stoneroff and Kahn Primer, as well as the MoMA exhibitions, constitute the main sources for the Better Philadelphia exhibition, the first show devoted to post-war American city planning, where neighborhood was officially acknowledged as the cornerstone of the city-nation and used to inaugurate a plan for civic improvement. Presenting city planning as a large-scale application of an everyday process, the exhibition adopted tools, techniques, and modes of displaying of the booklet and the documentary proposed by Stoneroff, confirming the intent to encourage the participation of architects, inhabitants, and institutions in neighborhood design through human community planning and democratic participant housing, and highlighting how the world discourse on neighborhood design has a crucial impact on post-war housing, when neighborhoods started to be the new design tool and unit of city planning. I'm only introduced my third trajectory as a conclusive remark. In the frame of Marshall Plan, neighborhood emerged as a privileged ground of exchange between America and Europe, considered as the expression of a system of value representing American democracy, and shifting its meaning from a value of wartime America to a transnational concept disseminated across post-war Europe. As the Italian case showed, neighborhood became an epistemological framework, an essential reference and the recurrent rhetoric in the post-war practice and instances of architects and planners, generated a neighborhood ideology and mobilizing multiple forms of modernity, bringing to the light the various interpretation and ambiguous translation of the concept like quartiere, vicinato, comunità, in the usage in technical planning, reconstruction policies, and public housing programs. Crystallized in graphic tools, organizational schemes with a purely visual significance and in empty special strategies, was converted in a technical instrument denouncing a partial understanding of the original social value and special character and the distance between the notion of neighborhood and the notion of quartiere, regarded as a social entity but also a political tool to criticize contemporary society. Enhanced also as an instrument of reconstruction program, neighborhood nourished the post-war architectural culture, becoming a normative assumption used by department and design office of well-known public agencies like Inacasa, or during the 60s as a planning and technical device, the Unità di Vicinato, that laid the basis for the design of new settlement model like satellite organic city in the frame of new plans of territorial scale. By concluding, neighborhood acquires strategic value in mid-century architectural culture, diffused across the emerging Cold War networks, when assumed strategic value in terms of global politics through the encounter with local planning cultures, technological achievements, way of living, presenting interesting processes of reception, adaptation, hybridization, mistranslation that generated often forms of resistances, introducing interesting stories of misunderstanding. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaia, both directly and indirectly. And I realized I forgot to introduce you, so I'm going to do that now. Maybe everybody knows you. Gaia is an assistant professor in at the Politecnico di Milano, and she's written and published widely on 20th century housing with a particular focus on transnational migrations of ideas, as you also just saw in this presentation. I'm going to open the panel for questions, comments, discussions. And I encourage you just to unmute yourself and speak up. And if we have too many people speaking at the same time, we can start using the chat. Nelson.
Okay, thank you, Suzanne, and thank you very much, Gaia. It was lovely seeing you again, and also this topic of the neighborhood is super interesting. And I think what you brought about sort of triggers this question to me. I mean, the scale of these neighborhoods and indeed this idea of the neighborhood units. I mean, what is the criteria or criterion used to define, so how big is this, right? Because in many places I know that, like you just said, this neighborhood ideology was very, was instrumental, let's say, in housing policies that defined the neighborhood as a kind of, the basic social, group, let's say. But maybe in India, let's say, the concept of neighborhood is different from the one in the US, and maybe also different in Italy. So is there, also in terms of scale, is there something that, that is meaningful to take into account?
Okay. Thank you for the question, Nelson. I just introduced at the very end, as a final remark, this focus on the misinterpretation, misunderstanding, mistranslation, we can say, but also appropriation of the notion of neighborhood in the Italian context, highlighting the fact that there is a process of not simplification, but depuration of the original values and contents, and it started to become in post-war Italian culture really a graphic tools, an organizational structure that lose all these aspects. So the notion of scale, in fact, in all these processes of translation, it's not so relevant, because in the notion of quartiere, it's not considered at all. In the interpretation of unità di vicinato, it's more the organizational element of the school. But what I wanted to highlight, it's focusing on the war culture in the United States that I think anticipated in a very interesting and unexpected way certain discourses on participation, community design, involvement of inhabitants, both through a dialogue with private and public investors. So this is what I found particularly interesting. It's more related to the structure, to the agency, we can say, so to the way of connecting the activity of inhabitants, designers, neighborhood organization, and city commission, while there is not a specific structure like there is in Clarence Perry neighbor unit. So my idea was to highlight a different path, not alternative, but I'm thinking that the experience of the settlement work, it's more related to what happened in the war period into the United States in this development of participatory process with this leading role of architects. So you mentioned this morning the new role of professional culture, the definition of the new practice. I think this is something that happened during the war as a response to the instance of the war, but is not so related to organizational principles and schemes like Clarence Perry's idea of neighbor unities. So I don't know if I answer.
Sure. Thank you.
Oh.
I have a question. Do you think that part of the maybe I wouldn't say change, maybe change from the individual unit to the unit of the neighborhood is due to changes in economic powers? The economic powers want bigger units to control. And the second question is, do you think, or maybe not a question, maybe a comment, I think maybe it's a deconstructing way to see a city, dividing it into neighborhoods.
This is exactly, I think, the point. I wanted to highlight the relevance of the work culture because I think this is the lens we can use to understand this new attention, growing interest and reinterpretation, reconceptualization of the neighborhood. The neighborhood is the unique scale, manageable scale during the war period for architects to deal with the city. This is, I think, surely one relevant aspect because it's the scale where there is the possibility to experiment a new mode, a new set of participation, but at the same time is the scale that manage to think a transformation at the scale of the city without a master plan, without wider processes of planning. So I think this point is important. And also the other aspect that you highlighted before related to the intermediate unit, I think there is a big legacy of the sociological researches that are rooted also in the experiences of the neighborhood house. But for the first time, this discourse is translated in the architectural culture. My feeling, but I have not a clear response, that the conjuncture of the war, so the fact that there is not possibility to design, to build, use and find in neighborhood a very interesting theoretical framework also to think post-war architectural culture and post-war planning. So it's a kind of accelerator, we can say, of certain researchers, of certain processes that will deeply influence post-war architectural culture. And defense housing, this is why the war, I think it's so crucial, defense housing projects and the federal structure of work that define a very interesting agency mode of operating deeply affect, I think, this reflection at the scale of the neighborhood. I don't know if I answered to. I don't know if I answered to your question.
Yeah, maybe everything except the economic part, and which is more, I think, more recent, when it's less. But your answer was more grounded in what in your presentation.
No, I forgot in relation to the economic part. What is interesting, but I start just included in one slide, is that this debate took shape through the support of neighborhood organization and city planning commission, but is a clear attempt to involve in the agency, in the structure, in the organization, private investors and private actors. And so what I found interesting, that maybe can open up to a further investigation, is how at a certain point in private intervention of collective housing, large-scale estates, there is this new debate about neighborhoods that became a kind of sales strategy for developers and investors to promote the intervention. So that enter also in the language of the market through this debate during the war as an alternative to urban renewal and urban sprawl. But there is this shift from the public discourse to also the debate promoted, and the pamphlet show very well, by private investors that invest on community facilities, cores, and services as an added value, let's say, in these programs. So what it's interesting is this interaction is proposed, of course, between banks, local industries, developers, and public institutions in the process of regeneration of neighborhoods, that I think anticipate a lot of phenomena that we can find in the 50s and in the 60s, probably, in Europe.
I find it fascinating that this is coming at a moment where after the neighborhood unit was developed as an idea, which was in the 20s and 30s, but now it's being applied to an existing built-up area, right? So as a strategy to what we would call revitalize or rehabilitate now. And at the same time, the neighborhood unit as a new concept is being built through the defense housing. So it's both being sort of built on right outside the cities, and it's being used inside the cities, which is very different than what happened after, when basically urban renewal took on the idea of the neighborhood unit to say, we have to do complete slum clearance, do a super block, so recreate the perfect neighborhood in the city. And maybe just one comment to the question of economy. I mean, in the pre-war period, or the interwar period in the US, that one of the arguments for the neighborhood unit outside of the city was to say, we don't want to do slum clearance, we want to build on cheap land, and it should be in part, like Catherine Bauer advocated for a decommodified version of housing, right? This ties into the last session, a sort of cooperative model of housing provision, which she tied explicitly to new construction on cheap land outside of the cities, because slum clearance is incredibly expensive because you have to buy out the private property. So I think there are always sort of economic models associated with any of these things. What I think is so fascinating with the moment you're showing, Gaia, is again that there's all of a sudden an idea which was previously developed is being used towards different ends and different locations, like in existing neighborhoods.
I want just to highlight that the presentation wanted to show when the discourse entered in the architectural debate. So it's an history of a discourse that started during the war period in the architectural culture through magazine, exhibition, demonstration projects. And the shift in the wider research is from informal concept of social needs and aspiration in the settlement work to planning tools, to the architectural debate that during the war period it's emerged through a growing interest and a kind of acceleration of research among architects.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Mariana and Jesse.
Hi, it's more a comment because I don't know very well how to put it, but I think something interesting about a conference like this is that you see the same terms and processes from different point of views. And since Nelson started doing it, I was also thinking that in Brazil, usually slums are depicted as community. You never know it's something like prejudice against it because you say it is a community. You don't use the term for a regular, so-called regular neighborhood. So always it's slums that are a community. And you do have like planning models that is, like Suzanne said, to trying to turn the slum, the community, into a neighborhood. And it seems that a neighborhood here, as it's like so private, so individual, so about ownership, then you don't have the sense of community anymore. So I'm just trying to think in different contexts, this relation between neighborhood and community, what kind of, and that leads me to the idea that you are dealing with social relations that are different in each context and economic interest, so just interconnection. Thank you again for your presentation.
Jesse?
Thank you so much, Gaia. This was fascinating. And I have a very basic question that goes to my lack of knowledge of Italian architectural history. But to what extent were the neighborhoods to what extent did war damage offer a reshaping of the map of neighborhoods, or to what extent were ideas of what a neighborhood had been before bombings, for example, create the geographic, set the map into which new ideas of what a neighborhood should be were then fit?
I just addressed the Italian case showing possible lines of investigation. So neighborhood was started to be used in the frame of post-war reconstruction program by Casa, but also in the planning culture to legitimate an attention for American culture, vehiculating values really of American democracy. So it was used also in an instrumental way, introduced in the debate to propose a way of living, a mode of inhabiting. So there were very different declinations. What is evident that the debate in the discourse became a kind of ideology, an obsession, a recurrent references that was used also in an appropriate way by architects in practices and discourse in the span of 10 years, from 45 to 55. And you can observe the different interpretation looking at housing programs, or planning culture, or in what is very interesting, I showed Quaroni definition in his neighborhood, in forms of resistances that highlight the distance between the notion of quartiere and what is the idea of neighborhood coming from abroad. But what happened, it became a kind of organizational system used also then in institutional materials, plans up to the territorial plans of the 60s in a kind of spontaneous way. So entered also in the codes, in the standards, in the programs without losing this acception, this connotation that I had in the original context. But I think it's a wider field to be investigated that I have not addressed yet.
Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, I think some, if not, I suggest moving on to Karen's presentation, which overlaps in parts with Gaia's analysis in the 1940s. Are there any other immediate questions to Gaia? No. Okay, so Karen Kubey is an urbanist focused on housing and health. She's based in New York. Just completed a year at the University of Oregon as a social justice fellow, and was for several years the executive director of the Institute for Public Architecture in New York. She has edited an issue of Architecture Design called Housing as Intervention, Architecture Towards Social Equity. So I'm going to share your video. Nelson kindly alerted me that the sound was not so good on your end. So I'm going to see if I can do this better this time by checking a different box.
So when you click the share screen, then you will see on the bottom left a little box with share screen sound. So you have to tick that box.
Yeah, here in German it's called release the computer audio. So I guess that's that.
Yeah.
Perfect. Does that mean that I can then mute myself? Probably. I'll try that. Okay. Karen, here you go.
Great. Thanks so much, all.
Sorry, I have to enter my password. Give me a second. Sorry about this. Give me a second. Okay. Let me know if this works.
Hello, my name is Karen Kubey, presenting from Brooklyn, New York. My paper is Neighbors.
Were you able to hear that?
Yes, was perfect.
Okay. American beliefs on housing and race through portraits of its ideal residents. Through 3 case studies, this paper will examine how the term neighbor has shaped housing discourse policy and architecture in the United States over the last 75 years. I will discuss a 1940s Museum of Modern Art, or MoMA, exhibition that positions the neighbor as a promoter of democracy, a 1990s publication arguing that affordable housing residents and their well-designed buildings can make good neighbors, and a recent community advocacy project for more neighbors that successfully influenced local policy to allow for multifamily housing in formerly single-family zones. The curators, authors, and organizers of these projects use this friendly term to promote their agendas on race and the built environment. The World War II era MoMA exhibition distributed a vision of white middle-class suburbia. The 1990s housing book promoted multiculturalism. And the 2010s grassroots campaign was explicitly anti-racist and anti-segregationist. 1944, MoMA's Look at Your Neighborhood. The press release from MoMA's Look at Your Neighborhood exhibition states, quote, "There was never a time when the word neighbor meant as much as it does today. For the neighbor is beginning to realize he is a master of his fate if he lives in purposeful fellowship of neighbors, which is perhaps a pretty good definition of that vast and hazy word, democracy," unquote. I will show how curators use this idea to spread a vision of the American suburb as a democratic microcosm, albeit an exclusively white one. Opening March 29th, 2 months before D-Day, Look at Your Neighborhood anticipated a post-war can-do attitude of individual empowerment. As World War II waned, American military personnel returned home from abroad to rebuild their lives, and civilians previously engaged in the domestic war effort sought a new outlet for their collective energy. The personal language in the exhibition reflected this and contrasted with the more physical and urban terms used in previous MoMA shows like the 1939 Houses and Housing. Look at Your Neighborhood was produced not by the museum's Architecture and Industrial Arts Department, but rather by the Publications Department, led by Monroe Wheeler, in collaboration with the museum's circulating exhibitions and publicity departments. MoMA coordinated with external partners and United Neighborhood Houses groups, as well as New York State and US government agencies, to develop and circulate the exhibition. Neatly packed into one light shipping crate, weighing 35 pounds and easily rentable at $8 for 3 weeks, the exhibition traveled in 5 years to over 100 neighborhoods across the country, in schools and institutions ranging from the New York City Citizens Housing and Planning Council to the local library of Bangor, Maine, to Columbia University, to the Fireman's Insurance Company of Newark. Largely developed by and for women, its grassroots approach to neighborhood planning targeted white middle-class women and their husbands who were active at home and in their communities. You and your neighborhood. The exhibition aimed to involve the individual in planning and activating their neighborhood. The message of personal responsibility was clear. Housing and planning decisions were no longer solely the domain of the government and of architects, but in the hands of individual citizens. Look at Your Neighborhood and its accompanying didactic pamphlet, You and Your Neighborhood, defined a neighborhood precisely as, quote, 1,000 to 1,500 families group around an elementary school, end quote. And with it, the ideal neighbor, someone who was actively involved in planning the neighborhood by engaging their neighbors and government agencies to fight for the facilities they need. The exhibition presents this new neighborhood vision as an antidote to crowded, unhealthy life in the city. Though race is never mentioned explicitly in writing, the show depicts a white, middle-class, heterosexual nuclear family alongside a drawing of an orderly, spacious neighborhood offering, quote, planning begins with you, your family, your neighborhood, end quote. Together you will, quote, have the chance to become a real community of responsible citizens, end quote. It was up to neighbors or citizens working together to motivate their neighborhood and in turn their nation to improve living conditions. The exhibition introduced its audience to urban planning concerns by moving from the micro to the macro, beginning with an image of a happy family seated around the dinner table and zooming out to show that family as part of a larger neighborhood. At the exhibition's opening, co-curator and New United Neighborhood Houses Vice President Mary Simkovich suggested this approach was more than a curatorial device. Quote, I do not have to go far afield to find out what the world needs. It is all implied in our daily neighborhood relationships. The neighborhood can never plan efficiently except in the larger framework of city, state, and national action, end quote. Look at Your Neighborhood's exclusive focus on white neighbors reflected a period of government-sanctioned and enforced segregation in the United States. In particular, Federal Housing Administration loans established in 1934 supported redlining and favored developments with racially restrictive covenants. The exhibition foreshadowed and perhaps even paved the way for a racist segregationist post-war legacy. Less than 2% of housing units financed by Veterans Affairs and Federal Housing Association loans from 1946 to 1959 were purchased by Black families. 1997, Good Neighbors, Affordable Family Housing. Half a century later, housers took on the racialized negative stereotypes of affordable housing dwellers and affordable housing developments that resulted from decades of discriminatory policies. In 1997, San Francisco Bay Area architects R. Thomas Jones, Michael Piatok, and William Pettis published Good Neighbors, Affordable Family Housing Designed for Living, an influential resource for a generation of American housing designers and advocates. I will analyze how the term neighbor frames the three sections of the book: resident profiles, case studies, and policy design guidance, linking the non-threatening roles of affordable housing buildings and their inhabitants, and embodying an era of multiculturalism. Good Neighbors aims to make the reader imagine as someone living in market rate housing. It aims to make them comfortable with the residents of affordable housing who may move into their neighborhood. The book begins with, quote, who are these families and why do they need affordable housing? They are often our neighbors, the people we see on the bus, our children's playmates, and the workers in our communities. Seeking to counter welfare queen and related stereotypes, the book reminds the reader that, quote, most residents of affordable family housing work, unquote, and offers a subtle critique of insufficient and inequitably distributed housing subsidy with facts and figures like these. Good Neighbors focuses on family households only, but highlights a diversity of families, particularly single parent and large families. A chapter called Meet Your Neighbors tells the stories of families living in affordable housing. Each profile paints a picture of the family's life before their move into their new home, and then shows how the building's designs improves the family's lives. Neighbor Susan Clifford offers, "It's great to have light and ventilation for both sides, and having 2 bathrooms is nice so we don't have to wait in line. The play structure in the courtyard is a focal point around which families can come together and discuss things," end quote. The book presents the families as friendly neighbors worthy of better housing. Good Neighbors was published as America saw a resurgence in race consciousness not seen since the 1960s civil rights movement, with events like the 1992 Los Angeles riots giving rise to a focus on multiculturalism in the political arena and in the media. Good Neighbors' portrayal of deliberately racially diverse families was part of this zeitgeist. The book was also timely from a policy point of view, published 11 years after the creation of the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC, as part of the Tax Reform Act of 1986. Good Neighbors showcased architecture produced through this program, which incentivizes private development of housing for low-income residents and supports about 90% of rental affordable housing created in the United States. The heart of the book is a series of 83 richly illustrated American housing case studies organized by geographical region. The buildings themselves are presented as good neighbors to wealthier residents' homes. Lower rise and smaller developments feature prominently, as do designs with suburban single-family home style details like pitched roofs. Just as the resident profiles combine financial and personal information, the case studies include development data alongside stories of the project's creation and information on how the designs respond to local conditions and resident cultures. The case study for Nuevo Amanecer Apartments, a 90-unit project for farm workers in Woodburn, Oregon, by architects Robertson, Merriman, and Barnes, for instance, includes a description of how the design responds to the needs of predominantly Hispanic residents and argues that both the new neighbors and the buildings they live in will benefit existing residents economically. Quote, Nuevo Amanecer shows that housing for working families who are essential to the local economy can be an asset for the whole community, unquote. A far cry from Tower in the Park public housing, these are presented as the kinds of buildings the reader should want in their neighborhood. 2019, Neighbors for More Neighbors. Despite reforms in the 1990s and beyond, 20 years later, intractable segregation invited explicitly anti-racist action. The community group Neighbors for More Neighbors rallied against single-family zoning in Minneapolis, and in 2019 achieved the successful passage of the city's 2040 comprehensive plan, which allows triplexes citywide. I will show how the advocates deployed the term neighbor to fight for housing for more than nuclear families, countering what they see as institutional racism in the form of local zoning. Through social media, lawn signs, and in-person organizing, Neighbors for More Neighbors, formed by housing advocates in 2017, helped to frame discussion around the Minneapolis 2040 plan during the city's 2-year public engagement process. Minneapolis has the widest Black and white home ownership gap in the country. Only 1 in 4 African-American households, compared to 4 in 5 white households, owns their home, according to the American Community Survey. When Neighbors for More Neighbors began their campaign, more than 60% of the city was zoned for single-family zoning. Designation the group argued emerged from racist intentions and led to racial disparities. Quote, we believe in housing for all. We believe zoning is currently a powerful tool of institutional racism, and we believe in dismantling that power. We believe that increasing the amount of housing units available in all neighborhoods can help to make entire cities affordable. The campaign joined others from around the country that attempt to address housing affordability and racial and economic equity through land use regulation reforms. Neighbors for More Neighbors categorizes itself as part of the YIMBY, or Yes in My Backyard movement, a pro-development response to NIMBYism, or Not in My Backyard. The group's Facebook page urges followers to, quote, talk to your friends about zoning, support YIMBYism, and more neighbors in our backyard. We're Yabers, not neighbors. The group's policy platform refers to new neighbors as compared to PyTalk's good neighbors, aiming to give access to those who otherwise would not be able to live in exclusive gentrifying neighborhoods. Quote, zoning makes wealthy single-family areas off limits to new housing development. The solution to this is allowing all our neighborhoods to grow. Every neighborhood has an obligation to welcome our new neighbors and a more equitable and affordable city, unquote. Operating during national fights over immigration, particularly President Trump's 2017 Muslim ban, Neighbors for More Neighbors, welcoming language toward those who might otherwise be excluded from Minneapolis neighborhoods, reflects larger pro-immigrant movements. Their lawn signs echoed the pro-immigrant signs that popped up on front lawns around the country with messages often in multiple languages like, quote, no matter where you're from, we're glad you're our neighbor, unquote. With the 2019 passage of the comprehensive plan, which the city is required to produce every 10 years, Minneapolis became the first major American city to end single-family zoning, the exclusive zoning. The plan also reduces parking requirements. Echoing Neighbors for More Neighbors focus on addressing racial injustice, the first goal of the plan is to, quote, eliminate disparities, unquote, in housing and other equity factors based on race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, and zip code. The official document uses the term neighbors only rarely, referring instead to, quote, communities and, quote, the people of Minneapolis, but does seek to, quote, build people's long-term capacity to organize to improve their lives and neighborhoods. Where Look at Your Neighborhood depicted neighbors as only white middle-class nuclear families and good neighbors sought to share a racially and socially diverse set of families, Neighbors for More Neighbors went further by explicitly naming racism and advocating for all residents, not just those in single-family households. The three examples shared just now were each a product of their time, reflecting contemporary policy goals and debates and the nation's racial consciousness or lack thereof. Each deployed the term neighbor more than the larger family or community or the physical housing or city to frame their political agenda for the built environment as a personal appeal, calling on their audience's sense of individual responsibility within the familiar place of the neighborhood. Not only reflecting existing understandings, these three cases reframed wide-held assumptions of who and what neighborhoods are for. They opened up new political and architectural features for housing through their shifting depictions of the ideal American resident, the good neighbor. Thanks very much.
Fantastic, thank you. I imagine there will be many questions and comments on this.
Thanks so much. And it was super nice to get this recorded before all the excitement in the United States.
Any thoughts or comments or questions from beyond the United States? Okay, I'm going to ask a question. Are there, I thought it was a very interesting shift because typically we do talk about neighborhoods in planning and architecture, not so much about neighbors. Maybe we talk about users or we talk about the community, which you also, there's sort of these, they're all somewhat vague, but I think you pinned it down very nicely that neighbors, talking about neighbors actually brings it down to the individual person and that there's an appeal associated with that. And you had some fantastic quotes. In the first case, it was like a real community of responsible citizens, right? So, and that was really about people who were already there, whereas the other two examples were talking about new neighbors or new people, or even advocating for people who are not yet organized as a community or as an association. So I'm wondering whether you have, whether you feel that beyond these three examples, there were others you could have used, or are these actually quite unique? I mean, to me, it's quite new. That I don't hear a lot of talk about neighbors. It's generally much more about community, the community, which is in a way much bigger. So, like, how did you arrive at this topic? Were there other examples and that you selected these three from, or where do you see this going?
Right. I guess I can. Let's see how to respond to that. Yeah, I think. I would say that I did not encounter other examples. There may be, but these were the three that I saw. And I'll just be honest and say that I love what happened was I was trying to, you have this beautiful brief, and I was working on, I think I was trying the word family, and it wasn't working. Then I realized, looking more closely, I had done research on the MoMA show. I did a class with the then curator, Barry Bergdahl, where we got to dig through the archives. So I had done that, and then I'm working now on a new version of the Good Neighbors book. And then I had just heard a beautiful presentation about neighbors for more neighbors. So the answer is really a personal one, which is that I realized that I had these three examples, and I was curious, through writing the paper, to see how the word is used differently. And I would say, you mentioned, that in the first case, who are these examples? Who's the audience? Who are these examples addressing? And I'm not sure, in the first case, if it's people who are already there, because it might be people who would be moving to new suburbs. But it's definitely addressing, you're the person, you're the neighbor, and look at your neighborhood. You're the neighbor, and you need to be responsible for creating this new neighborhood. In the second one, you're probably white in all of them also. The second one, you're someone already living in a neighborhood. There are new people, new buildings potentially come into your neighborhood, and you're afraid, and you're probably afraid economically. And so it's arguing that, no, these people in these buildings are good neighbors. They're going to make your life better, and it's all part of, an ecosystem you need to support. And then the third one also is similar. It's saying, we need to be welcoming, probably appealing to people living in these segregated neighborhoods in Minneapolis, saying, just like we as a country need to be welcoming to immigrants, we as neighbors living in these segregated single-family housing neighborhoods need to be welcoming to more people from Minneapolis.
Thank you. Other comments or questions?
Hi, I was waiting for someone else wanted to raise a question. If not, I'd like to bring again the issue of community. I think in both talks, community was a word that was mentioned a lot of time, and that raised me the question: if you want to discuss terminology, and I'm not trying to make it away from our neighborhood. On the contrary, I think this is a term that seems to be, according to what you just said, important to think neighborhood in the same sense of not taking it for granted, but to reflect on when it's used, why, what forms a neighborhood, what constitutes a community, and what's the relationship between both. And my guess is that this has different meanings across the world, because one of the main factors is the rent inequality. It depends on, and racial, gender, and class would be, but the rent inequality and perhaps race as well, both connected, I believe, make a lot of difference. That's why, in a very unequal society, Brazil is one of the most, it's not a poor country, it's a rich country, but it's very, very unequal. And then what makes a community in an equal country is different, or a neighborhood is different from what makes a quartier in Italy, and what makes a neighborhood in the US. I don't know. It's more a comment. If you want to talk about it, don't worry.
But I think that's the interesting about an interesting shift in talking about neighbors, which to me sound like individual people, and also the way in all these portrayals it's about maybe one family or one individual. It's actually avoiding this idea, or not addressing directly, that you somehow need to have a common agenda or a common set of values. It's opening it up to a more of a sense of public, which that's what surprised me when I first heard of this proposal. I was like, oh yeah, what happens when you talk about neighbors as opposed to community? at least, again, this is, of course, I'm framed from a US context, where community always assumes that there's some sort of collective and everybody has the same goals. And I feel like when you talk about neighbors and maybe even neighborhoods, it allows for a more open, more diverse set of interests. But that's just sort of my intuitive response.
May I give a comment?
Of course.
It just because before I didn't answer to Mariana. In fact, in the primer by Stoneroff and Kahn that I showed, that it's a document for a wider public. So the idea is that architects act as educators in order to frame this scale of values from the unit of the family to the unit of the city. The community is an intermediate scale that contains 15 neighborhoods. So there is also a normative frame, because the neighborhood is for 10,000 families, and then there is the community, and then there is the citizen association and the city planning commission. So it's interesting also this double level, because has also a normative assumption in this idea of scales of value that are proposed.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because each example, you know, has neighbor at its center, but is always using that to relate to a different scale. So I would say the first one, you know, is really focused on the scale of the neighborhood. And, you know, we can debate the degree to which it reaches or tries to reach a diverse audience. I think it might, you know, look at the neighborhood just because then it excludes everyone but the white middle class nuclear families who are represented. And the second one, Good Neighbors, really the focus in the book is the scale of the housing development. So there's a lot of focus, you know, you start to understand the more public and more private aspects of those developments. That's really, you know, there's a discussion of the relationship between the sort of newcomers and people who already live there. But that's sort of focus. And the third one uses neighbor to really talk about the whole city of Minneapolis.
If I may, I really want to applaud the two speakers, Gaia and Karen, for their presentations. I think I'm much older than most of the people in this room. And I remember being asked in 1980 or 1981 to speak at the Salzburg Congress on Urban Planning and Development about some of the work we were doing in community development in the South Bronx, which was primarily a community of color. And the reaction to the term community in Salzburg at that time, primarily a group that was from Germany, the Netherlands, one or two people from Italy, maybe one or two from France, but primarily Northern Europe, was one that was very negative. The word community was associated much more with fascism and exclusion. And when we begin to look at what Karen was describing in the United States, a lot of the segregation patterns came about because neighbors forced the public to take racist actions. The private sector was, mores were adapted by the federal government. So as much as some of us praised and adored Franklin Roosevelt and the Democratic Party at that point in time, a lot of the segregationist patterns, a lot of the racist patterns in development that haunt the United States till today emerged at that period of time. Instead of really being able to use this, use the federal intervention in such a way as to really create a much more equitable format for development post-World War II, it didn't take place. And part of it you could understand because the politics did not allow it in the United States. The role of the strong Southern states and the Democratic Party forced Roosevelt to compromise to get even what parts of the New Deal he was able to get through. But I think we have to understand that context of Europe emerging from fascism to having a much clearer understanding of what the word community might mean. And Gaia's definitions are basically quantitative definitions of what a community is. and yet there are qualitative aspects to it, which I think Karen begins to unravel as well. So the two taken together, I think, are very profound.
Thank you for that comment. I think we had one, Monica, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just a brief comment, because I found what Mariana was saying is very interesting, because I think what Mariana was pointing is about a shift from a focus on scale. Gaia was talking about scale when she was talking about neighborhood and community. And community in the Global South means something that has to do with social bonds. And usually we take for granted that in the Global South, or in slums, or in these kind of places, a community, a group of people is a community and has social bonds, whereas in the North or healthier countries, this doesn't happen. So I think it's a different approach, and it has to be, it has different meanings, of course, and it's just a question whether we are talking about scale or about social bonds, and that has to be clarified, the terminology, I think. But that was just a small remark.
I mean, I think the interesting thing on looking at terms is they can be used by very different people towards very different ends, right? So what Ronald Schiffen was just pointing out is that it was neighborhoods who didn't want any change, who defined themselves as a community from change, right? From saying we don't want public housing, so keep them out. So you can use architecturally the neighborhood character, right? You can sort of freeze a condition by, let's say, appealing to historic preservation, even though your goal is actually to keep certain people out. So, you can, the definition of community can be used for, or advocating community can be used for very different ends. I suggest we move on to Valentin and Chiara's presentation.
Yeah.
I think will be interesting in terms of different scales and more specific focus on architectural and typological models. Valentin Borden is a PhD student in Lausanne at the EPFL, and his research explores the debate on the common as an opportunity to re-theorize architectural principles. He's also been working in Brussels, and Chiara is also based at the EPFL in Lausanne. And her recent research has focused on interwar housing in Scandinavia, and she recently co-edited an issue of Urban Planning called Housing Builds Cities. So I am going to share my screen again.
Sorry, it is possible to do it in live, or?
You want to do it live? Sure.
Because I can't share my screen.
Yeah, go for it.
I can't, sorry.
Oh, you can't? Oh, then I need to make you a host, I think.
Can you try now?
Yeah.
Yes, right now Valentin Borden is actually a co-host of the conversation.
Yeah. Okay.
It's up here. Okay.
Don't forget to enable the shared computer sounds. Did you do that?
I will speak. There is no sound. There is no videos.
Oh, okay, that's fine.
You're welcome.
Okay, good afternoon to everybody. We are particularly glad to be here, and especially to are participating to these 4 days are very stimulating event, let's say a platform on multifaceted perspectives, starting from the initiative of the research group, namely the reterritorizing the architecture of housing.
So the concept of common has grabbed a long-lasting attention from social sciences in order to understand how social organization and physical form are related or could be related if one precedes the other in a mutual shape and legitimation. According to Massimo De Angelis about the commons, when associated with governance of horizontality shared resources, community involves communing practices. As far as housing is concerned, it primarily refers to the idea of neighborhood that recent debates on communing invite to reconsider. Likewise, the architectural discipline shows interest in that precise field of research to which it is approaching through its own tools. The understanding of the spatial arrangement, expression of being in community, facilitate architecture culture to employ them in the design practice. In 1929, the American sociologist and urban planner Clarence Arthur Perry formulated one of the most significant standpoints on the subject, the neighborhood unit, whose enduring relevance deserves not only to be measured, but also to be compared with its historical antecedents and the multiple application over times. Indeed, the key principle of planning and also the partially built experimental neighborhood unit plan of Radburn traveled across the Atlantic in so much as this inspired the post-war reconstruction of the social structure of the community.
The neighborhood plan is...
Eu não consigo acreditar como você não foi buscar... Não, eu tenho...
Sorry, I put it on mute. Let's continue.
May I continue? Okay. The neighborhood unit plan is here considered as a key tool to anticipate the creation of the community who lives close together. At first, the word unit deserved to be questioned. Clarence Arthur Perry explained very neatly to what he was referring in the incipit of his The Neighborhood Unit. Quote, the above title is a name which, to facilitate discussion, has been given to the scheme of arrangement for a family life community that has evolved as the main conclusion of the study. End of the quote. If the definition unit is particularly straightforward to understand, it is because the neighborhood is designed for the integral unit for planning, the economical unit for construction and administration, and the social unit for living, as clearly stated by Catherine Bauer in 1934. The word effectively comprises both the aspect, on the one hand measure and on the other hand action. On the contrary, the word scheme or plan generally has a more forward-looking meaning in the field of planning. As a matter of fact, it refers to all general recommendations before the final proposal of the project. A first hypothesis would be to hold the value of anticipation for the definition of neighborhood plan in order to preserve the hypothetical character of its development. In turn, such perspective could give to the neighborhood unit the possibility of its own realization.
So applied social sciences do not stop at merely understanding the topic. Instead, they employ their current knowledge to guide prospective studies in a similar fashion as architectural does with the project. The research of the American political economist Elinor Ostrom on the condition of collective action in the management of common pool resources is here particularly pertinent and instrumental in the action level, like architectural projects, through the recognition of facilitation conditions. To her, the community is associated with a resource that means going beyond that of being in community in favor of the practice of communing. According to Tribit Banerjee and William Beer, the neighborhood unit also enters precisely into this search for convergence of previously identified parameters, halfway between anticipation of practice and framework of action. It supposed a kind of commoning housing conditions. Both Ostrom's and Perry's approaches provide a bound relationship between observation and recommendation. They also advocate the importance of a profound understanding of the limits. On the one hand, the limit of the shared resource, and on the other hand, those of the community for which it is. In equal measure, to Ostrom's point of view, Perry sought to reduce the involvement of centralized forms of power in the local organization of communities too. In Perry's scheme, the role assigned to neighborhood association is nevertheless not exempt from traditionalism. Yet Perry buys the prerequisites of its conception about neighborhood on a rural tradition of cooperation, similarly to rural roots of common pool resources studied by Ostrom.
The recent resurgence of proximity policies and interest in collective action pushes to reconsider the neighbor unit beyond any ideological components. Despite a proven inadequacy, its persistence in the structure of the city is nevertheless visible, due to the inertia of the built form, but also to the mechanical repeated model. This twofold observation calls for the possibility of renewing the theoretical background of architectural principle by extending it from its original limits, but by defining its most limited mechanism, and then by restoring the universal scope associated to the architectural tool promoted by the American sociologist and urban planner. The critical rereading of three significant architectural experiences, namely French workers' housing settlement, secondly, community in the Swedish Folkhemmet contest, still Swiss housing cooperative groups, it is actually the third one focus, aims to assign concrete benchmark to this delineation of idea and spatial conception under different times and conditions around the term commune. The investigation accomplished to highlight the paradigm shift induced by the dynamics around the common in a temporal and speculative leap between the modern housing administration and its possible emancipation in a today expanding operational horizon.
In France, the interventionist attitude of the government in respect to the pragmatic need to house workers close to the large industries finds as precedent some compelling architectural experiments, like the Phalanstère by Charles Fournier. Before states, the employer paternalism dominates the command, inspired by utopian socialism and in reaction to the emergence of new inequalities generated by capitalism. The improvement of working-class housing pushed by the bourgeoisie constitutes both a powerful vector of authority and architectural invention. In the view of Phalanstère's detractor, the desire to privilege people for controlling was stronger than educating the most disadvantaged ones. Self-sustaining settlement, by definition a colony, especially in a new part of the country, came out from an authority which controlled lifestyle, rhythm, and condition. The defending the improvement of the living condition of the proletariat, the progress at the price of the coercion. Wood architecture summed up the hardest trait and the most praiseworthy aspiration. To a certain extent, such architectural form could be considered as a precursor of certain aspects developed later in the neighborhood unit chain. The organization by units serve here to contain and control the lifestyle of a social class gathering about a common courtyard, indeed as manifestation of an idea about communal interaction. The sterility of units was consistent in the very nature of the production that engaged it. It implies equality between workers in their unity, but also the pragmatic effect of the social condition. The recourse to repetition constitutes a privileged orientation for most architecture since the second wave of industrialization, and then it became predominant in the following century. The search for new optimization in close connection with the potential of neighborhood fostered the revolution of workers' home at the beginning of the 20th century. Beyond the French context, this appears under the expression minimum grouping pronounced by Victor Bourgeois in the 1929 Minimum Housing Program, to which he attributes the value of productivity and social assistance supervision.
In the position between capitalistic logic and state interventionism, we then propose an alternative or middle way, as coined by the American journalist Margaret Child in 1936. This corresponds to an intermediate political conception based on the feeling of belonging to a community, according to a peculiar balance between private individualism and public collectivism. Looking at Suez during his trip northwards, Gideon was surprised at the population needs for communal life in 1933. By definition, a community is a number of people associated together by the fact of residence in the same locality. In the Swedish reality, it corresponds to the folkhem, the people homes, of a nation family living under the shared roof of a social equality and welfare solidarity. This was the powerful metaphor deployed by the Social Democrats, who concretely conferred to housing provision and collective purposes a prominent position in their national programs. The formalization of the neighborhood condition resulted in two different outputs in terms of architectural program and scale of intervention. On the one hand, the experiment of the collative use, and on the other hand, new urban area, more complex and autonomous, both sensitive to place and conceived around local centrices that stimulate community life. In the light of new relation between individual, family, and working women, several prototypes of collective house question the domestic sphere and its organization. This encompasses in only one building the dwellings and all the collective services located in one floor. The main scope was to collectivize the housekeeper, as the American sociologist Alba Myrdal stated, but in practical terms, it strengthened the sense of responsibility and involvement of a small community gathered in the building. One of the well-known examples was designed by Sven Markelius in 1935. The realization of collective houses has persisted in Swedish panorama till today, like the example of collaborative housing or co-housing. In 1940s and 1960s, neighborhood units far from the city center are equally experimentation in this sense, but at large scale, of the interplay between the private unit and the public amenities. The seminal book, The Culture of the City, by Lewis Mumford, and the close collaboration between the American planner Clarence Stein and Swedish architects had a great impact in this sense. Vällingby was one of the remarkable suburban community, expressing the planning system summed up in the Markelius acronym ABC, let's say work, housing, and town centrum. The breakdown of the social structure into proportionately measured neighborhoods gives a supporting ground to the horizontal political model, or rather, the delegation of representativeness. The elaboration of neighbor union in Sweden caused also a opposite effect later. For example, like the expansion of the public sector into the social relation of the communities, to the detriment of the idea of a neighborhood identity nurtured by its inhabitants.
Before going through today's experimental project of actualized neighborhood theme as architectural tool in the Swiss context, it is important to look back at several experiences on the early 20th century, which demonstrate how Switzerland action appears as one of the most developed in this field. In Basel, Hans Meyer built the Siedlung Freidorf, 1919, that he described as a search for an intermediate position between political and architectural polarities. Yet he was halfway between a monastery and an institution, a garden city, and the Jura village. This corresponds to a group, in other words, an assemblage of a number of individuals related in some way. In advance of 10 years, Siedlung Freidorf partly anticipated the Clarence Arthur Perry theme. The cooperative house, Genossenschaftshaus, predate the community center of the neighborhood unit in terms of its central position and its close connection to the main open and public spaces, including community services and playgrounds. Meyer also strongly engaged Perry's recommendation regarding character and federative identity by articulating cooperative group into three types of housing. However, the overall result shows a very formal unity. Meyer concretized the idea of living together by inviting the inhabitants of Freidorf to live symbolically in the same house. This identification with the common house is nicely expressed in the recent Swiss production of housing cooperatives, organizing housing complexes within the same building unit. Looking at the neighborhood unit through the concept and applied thus to housing tends to endorse the definition of an architectural unity.
The focus here goes on two switch projects. On the one hand, Carbright by Müller-Stiglitz Architekten, and on the other hand, Ecoquartier Jonction in Geneva by Drian Architecture. Both the cases provide facilities not exclusively for the inhabitants, showing a balance between the collective and cooperative purposes, similar to a common form comprising private and sector. Space. Was necessary great scale of neighbor unit, nor the isolation that features the unité d'habitation. Rather, they seek to maintain a balanced relationship between local community and society. Besides the services for the inhabitants community, for example, the Cartwright building also offers other services like shops, restaurants, cinema, open to all the citizens, as well as integrate the tram hall in the basement, just beneath the green and equipped courtyard, at disposal for a very larger urban community. That means the inhabitants of the building and the urban citizens at large. Similarly to the pioneering Paris goals, this contemporary interpretation of the neighbor unit scheme strives for gradually remedy the denial of the opportunity for outdoor play for people who live in the flat. Conversely to its predecessor, the main innovation carried out by the recent generation of housing cooperative in Switzerland, and not only in Switzerland, it is the affirmation of an involvement in the making of the city and of the city as a common good, in contrast with the tendency to control a standardized lifestyle, as in American context of the 1930s. The relationship between the common unit and the city as a common good has emerged as one of the main urban challenges of contemporary habitation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe you could, yes, have everybody back. Comments and questions?
Do you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Hello, everyone.
Hi.
Thanks very much for the presentations. And it's not a question straight away, but I really like to see how indeed the notion of the neighborhood unit is so differently applied in the various contexts that we see here. So I can only add, for instance, that for the Dutch context, the neighborhood unit indeed is a very different notion. Usually it's the neighborhood ID that's been talked about. In Dutch you say wijkgedachte. And in the Netherlands it was used to organize diversity. Rather than creating homogeneous neighborhoods. So it was local government controlled, and then it was distributed between various housing corporations and, let's say, denominations of religiously inspired housing corporations, or the socialists, or the secular the humanist corporations. And the whole idea of mixing and mixing through the neighborhood is still a very dominant ideology in the Netherlands. So also in Amsterdam, there's a demand that all development has to have a certain equilibrium or balance between 20% for the market, 40% middle affordability, and 40% social housing. So this is, and the neighborhood unit is the unit that integrates this diversity, different architectural articulations. So it would be really interesting to learn more about what actors are behind what sort of actors are there who appropriate the tool of the neighborhood unit to plan for certain settlements or housing complexes. That's one comment, and the other thing is, but maybe you already mentioned this in the beginning. I wasn't there yet in the beginning. Is that it's of course a difference when architects and planners use it to plan, so intentionally a specific city district or a city extension, and when sociologists use the term. and they move into an existing territory, so to speak, and then talk about community and neighborhood. It's very different when architects talk, I'm going to build a community. And then, those two items I want to put on the table.
Actually, about what interpretation of communing the neighborhood unit we took, we tried to decline it, but we focused at an hypothesis on a very pragmatic attitude who lead Clarence Arthur-Perry to invent the principle of the concept of the neighborhood unit, which is quite pragmatic. Before being about politics, we tried to look at it in a very apolitical way to understand how this urban tool can be a pragmatic tool to manage resources and organization in a very local place, including housing and habitation. So that's why maybe around all the possibility of declination, we chose this pragmatic way of managing resources to build the proposal, the hypothesis of the paper, the comparative proposal between the approach of Ostrom on one hand, and that of Perry's in much more before, to understand how we can consider relevant still today this tool as a potential tool for architects, for the design, as a design tool, because you mentioned about to who it is concerned. We have to clarify how this tool, which can be old school one, could be or not still a relevant tool for architectural design. And in that sense, architecture is suffering about a very high difficulty on the 20th century, which can be resumed as the failure of the architecture of the good attention, no? As the failure of the architect as assuming some solution, spatial solution, or an authority of action through the control of the form. So this experiment of comparative analysis aims to go away about this difficulty and understand how architectural tools can be useful still today to serve this research of good managing of resources, without being too much authoritarian, with being very pragmatic in a special ways. So maybe it can be few points to respond to you about how architecture can still propose some element in a theoretical frame and support to valid terms, which are maybe not the same neighborhood unit, but that's why we try to decline it and to see on a historical trajectory how this work can assume different, more positive connotation through different contexts, no?
Any other comments or questions?
So maybe just a quick follow-up to Dirk's question, because indeed, so Dirk brought about this, so how the neighborhood unit is also used as a tool to integrate diversity. And since you also brought about this, I mean, the topic of commoning, and considering that commoning, has something to do with this, when a community manages the shared resource, values, traditions, and all that. I wonder whether you need to speak the same language to be able to have to be involved in this communication. And looking into Kalkbreite, for instance, in Zurich, I wonder to what extent, let's say, I know that the project has been celebrated as one of the examples of commoning in housing and all that, but on the other hand, it also looks like a pretty well-defined community, that it's not necessarily so open as one would think, and could even be seen as a tool for gentrification, right? Because it's related with a specific way of commoning that it's not actually so how to say embedded I mean, also so much engaged in prompting integration as one would think. I don't know, but maybe some matter for reflection or.
No, that's what point of the comparison. I think in the comparative analysis, we see that the critics of the critics. According to Ostrom's, were still valid on the application in architecture. So one of the critiques of Ostrom's work could be, in this way, the possibility of an autonomy, a too strong autonomy of the group to manage the resource, and what's still here in society, and what is the idea of society, which is according to her theory, the society for some critics disappear. So maybe we can also use these critics and use it on the architectural level as an attention to articulate the two scale of the community, the local one and the precious link according to urban context and the possibility to open it. In the case of Kalkbreite, it's clear that there is a sociological aspect, which is nothing to do with architecture, which can be people are choosing people like them to live with. But if we do the effort of understanding which are the architectural tools, and we focus on the social qualities and capacity of this project, we can accord some qualities of relationship between public space and the buildings, the position, the mixity. We talk about diversity, but also diversity of ownership, with a place of public transport in the basement and then a cooperative in the top. So maybe this quality, which are spatial and which are architectural, can be a support to develop an idea of architectural tools to support this type of commoning in the scale of the neighborhood.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think it's a good time to now move on to Vanessa's presentation. Nelson, could you share it again? Because I had to switch to my phone. Our internet was giving up. And I'm going to introduce Vanessa. Hello. Vanessa has just started as an assistant professor at TU Delft a few months ago. She's an architect, historian, and curator working on architecture's intersections with ideology, power, and governance. She co-curated last year's Sao Paulo Biennale, titled Everyday, and she has a forthcoming book called A Concrete Alliance, Communism and Modern Architecture in Post-War France. She is going to take us to Brazil, and I think it's a great link from Kalkbreite, which is a cooperative, also to some of the cooperatives that have been also much celebrated in Brazil. So maybe we can find a common thread of discussion afterwards.
The term I have chosen to focus on is Mutirão, a word that from the 60s onward came to encapsulate self-help processes of housing production in Brazilian cities. Mutirão has been given this more specific meaning by a constellation of scholars, architects, planners, politicians, technocrats, housing rights activists, and popular organized sectors of society. This paper will move back in time beyond this current understanding to show how this term has been used by a variety of actors towards different ends. Mutirão originally refers in a broader sense to the incidence of solidarity practices on the fringes of the rural work regime in Brazil among different racial groups since the colonial times. These practices, which translated into the reciprocal provision of all sorts of services, often involved most of the members constituting a neighborhood. This paper therefore sets out to investigate the genealogy, institutionalization, and anti-establishment assessments of the concept of mutirão in the theorization and production of housing in Brazil. It will do so by tracking its migrations across language, time, place, religion, race, gender, and technology, well beyond the divides between the vernacular and the modern, architecture and sociology, the right and the left. In August 1960, Revista Acrópole, one of the most influential design magazines broadcasting Brazilian modernism, featured the M fascicle of an illustrated dictionary of Brazilian architecture signed by Carlos Lemos and Eduardo Corona, two then prominent tenets of modern architecture in São Paulo. Closing the entry list was mutirão, a seemingly esoteric word for the way it was defined as follows. So it can be called the collective labor employed to build a mud house, among other works such as harvesting, based on mutual help, which is carried out by residents of a vicinity for the benefit of one at a time, a term arising very often among us as mutirão. End of quote. This word, originally derived from the Tupi indigenous language, appeared in Acrópole to be so alien to the lexicon of modernism. At the time, it was a widespread mode of mutual aid for the common achievement of tasks in rural Brazil as one procedure allowing access to housing. In fact, this was the only incidence of the word in the magazine during its 33-year time span. While provision of mass housing overlapped with the modernist ideals that permeated Acrópole and had been fully embraced by Brazilian architects, mutirão and related popular practices associated with housing for the masses were still seldom acknowledged. The social promises and plastic possibilities of reinforced concrete subsidized the reliance of Brazilian modern architects on the country's modernization. These capacities were, however, still far from shaping the hopes of these architects for housing the masses other than progressive industrial clients. And yet, Brazilian rural built environments did serve a Janus-faced purpose for generations following Lúcio Costa, who acted as a purveyor of the forms and low technologies of colonial Brazil. Key figures of Brazilian modernism, like Costa, had no bandwidth to take note of the participatory labor practices that underlay the forms and materials of the local architecture they esteemed. Such practices and techniques of the past were still put forward in communities without adequate access to technology, where material scarcity and racial and socioeconomic inequality prevailed. The interest in mutirão was nevertheless significantly pursued in other disciplinary circles since the 50s, when research on rural Brazil peaked in the humanities and social sciences. Officially commissioned documentation of rural life aimed to provide insights to answer the major transformations taking place in Brazilian society and territory due to rapid urbanization and modernizing processes. Clovis Caldeira, a communist civil servant of the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, carried market interpretations, sociological surveys that he gathered for the Institute in his 1956 book, Mutirão, Forms of Mutual Help in Rural Areas. Departing from mutual aid, a factor of evolution, a 1902 book by Russian anarcho-communist Peter Kropotkin, Caldeira aimed to situate the origins and vestiges of what he explained as a universal phenomenon, both biologically as an equally non-human practice, but also historically and ethnically in Latin America in general, and in particular in colonial and post-colonial realities in Brazil. He defined it as an amalgamation of black and white, men and women, across the Portuguese, Amerindian, and African cultural divides. I quote, "It is an ancient institution that we inherited from our indigenous populations. Mutirão, Mutirão, whatever you call it, there are multiple variants of the word. The fact is that the phenomenon appears early on, noted by travelers, foreigners, or indigenous chroniclers." End of quote. Caldeira's fundamental conclusion, as he announced in the book's introduction, was to stress the existence of, and I quote, "a rich reservoir of habits, feelings, and dispositions in Brazilian rural society which, if conveniently oriented, could play a relevant role in improving the life conditions of important human groups." End of quote. Caldeira went even further, pointing to its racial emancipatory potential, while explaining that 61 years prior to the Rio Branco law that declared free those born of slaves in the country, Juiz Veloso de Oliveira, and I quote, advocated solidarity work already rehearsed in what he called Mutirão, end of quote. Caldeira underlined that resorting to Mutirão in tasks ranging from agriculture to housing and infrastructure works, which often involved a festive component, was a custom of interest to the poor layers of the countryside that developed on the verge of Brazil's large landowners. Left-wing sociologist and literary critic Antônio Cândido considered Mutirão as a manifestation of greatest importance in the country society in his PhD dissertation defended in 1954 at the University of São Paulo on the lifestyle in São Paulo state of the so-called caipira or countryman. The study was only published into book form a decade later when Partners of Bonito River became a seminal work for Brazilian sociology, displacing it, and I quote, from the perspective of the dominant classes to the perspective of the dominated classes, end of quote, in Cândido's own words, while raising issues such as the urge for land reform in Brazil. It took nonetheless literally a village for Mutirão to start to be further acknowledged and even theorized in architecture, firstly by a small avant-garde formation of modern architects in São Paulo. Not a type-made village, but a modern one that was made from scratch at once, Brasília, and almost entirely in reinforced concrete, if it wasn't for its unplanned periphery. Modernism did materialize the colonial dream of the inland urban conquest of Brazilian territory, attracting the international spotlights for the speed through which it came about and for the way it engaged already internationally acclaimed Brazilian architects, Lúcio Costa and Oscar Niemeyer. Yet, at the apogee of Brazil's return to democracy after World War II, Brasilia was unable to defy social-racially unequal processes and house the poorest of the population, among whom were even the rural migrant workers who built it under challenging labor conditions. These workers were forced to resort to Mutirão to collectively build their own shacks in the divisive outskirts of a modernly airplane-shaped plano piloto. Incarnating the apogee of Brazilian planning expertise and techniques, Brasilia failed to counter the widespread informal mutual aid logic characterizing the favelas henceforth booming in every Brazilian city. The ideas of the São Paulo-based Arquitetura Nova trio took shape after one of its members, communist dissident Sérgio Ferro, was involved in the design of Brasilia. Structural Marxism, psychoanalysis, and self-management theories of the radical left afforded Arquitetura Nova insights toward a critique of the fate and pitfalls of Brazilian modernism from the perspective of ideology, production, and alienation. This ultimately led to Rodrigo Lefebvre's scholarly proposition of an emancipatory school construction site of brick vaulted techniques, where Mutirão would become a means not only to collectively overcome housing shortage and material scarcity, but ultimately to access land and citizenship. Lefebvre's 1981 master's dissertation proposed the pedagogical project that resonated with the teaching methods of Brazilian educator Paulo Freire, which also had repercussions among the progressive sectors of the Roman Catholics in Brazil. These concepts were also theoretically articulated in Ferros, O Canteiro e o Desenho, or the building site and the design, first published in Brazil while he was already in exile in 1979. While the Cold War-driven 1964 right-wing coup d'etat, which transformed Brasilia into the headquarters of a military dictatorship, interrupted the pursuit of Arquitetura Nova's theoretical investments, it also controversially became the context for the institutionalization of the Mutirão. Following the 1973 oil shock, which coincided with Brazil's economic decline, the country's dictators started to build on an international agenda for the Third World, developed since the 60s through programs such as the Alliance for Progress that institutionally supported self-help, mass housing in Latin America. While the military created National Bank for Habitation had hitherto failed to solve a rising housing shortage among the bottom strata of Brazil's urban population, it opportunistically implemented so-called alternative housing programs from the mid-70s to the mid-80s, which built on a rhetoric of Mutirão. One of these was demagogically named after the João de Barro, or oven bird, as an attempt to normalize self-help practices by claiming that they were inherent even to non-human life. Launched by a crumbling anti-democratic regime, the military-led institutionalized Mutirão was unsuccessful since it failed to involve in decision-making processes its beneficiaries who only acted as workforce. In some cases, the mismanagement of public resources in these programs ended up superseding the savings resulting from the use of unpaid labor. In view of this ideologically charged translation of Mutirão into an institutionalized form, a policy, as early as 1976, Brazilian architect Hermínia Maricato proposed to abandon the term to discuss self-help housing practices in Brazilian cities in her seminal essay, Auto-Construction, the Possible Architecture. Maricato was one of the main voices of a new generation of scholars who critically examined Brazil's urbanization from the standpoint of capitalist processes of social and spatial inequalities. She aimed to unveil the stakes of what she denounced as, and I quote, a forced solidarity, end of quote, as follows. It is not important to address the Mutirão itself, the artisanal characteristics of the process, but rather to relate it to a broader picture of the current stage of capitalist development in some dependent countries through the whole role that auto-construction plays in the reproduction of the labor force and the form that the growth of metropolitan areas assumes. The implication for Maricato was an anarchic clash across the divides of new and archaic, backward and modern modes of production and different cultural signifiers. For Maricato, they were ultimately reflected in the collision of both design and non-design in what she coined as possible architecture. That is, walls of uncoated cinder block, often the cheapest and yet unsustainable materials available in distant peripheries where auto-construction prevails, side by side with cutting-edge TVs. In spite of Maricato's consideration of the ineptitude of the concept of Mutirão to address the urban phenomenon of self-help in emerging economies, or the global south in more recent jargon, in Brazil's difficult path to democracy, from 1985 to today, the term could not be more up-to-date. On the one hand, Mutirão has been reenacted to challenge the urban effects of global capitalism by organized society, allied with new generations of architects, building on the legacy of Arquitetura Nova and on concerns with racial, gender, and environmental justice. On the other hand, the so-called entity session of the World Bank-led housing program Minha Casa Minha Vida also drew on a rhetoric of Mutirão. Whether the Mutirão is still capable of fulfilling Caldeira's anarchic-inspired hopes for an emancipated collective future is certainly debatable. Still, the study of the Mutirão seemingly lends itself as a productive methodological entry to unpack the imbrication of housing, neighborly relationship, and modernity, environmental, racial, and gender implications that are yet to be puzzle-pieced beyond divides that have long lived the urban and architectural history of Brazil. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. I know there are many experts here on Mutirão, so I will defer to them before I make any comments. But let me say, I very much appreciated learning about the early history of the term, which was new to me, and your setting in parallel of very different housing strategies today. Mariana, would you like to respond? Sorry, you're the obvious choice, but you don't have to.
I don't know, perhaps someone else has more to say about it, or perhaps I'm too much involved. But it was very, very interesting. I enjoyed very much the presentation. Of course, there are things that I can't say here in a quick way that because it would take more time. But what I can say, the good news, perhaps Vanessa knows about it already, is that the book of Sérgio Ferro that she mentioned is being translated into English, and that will, I think, give more. This is the book in Portuguese of his complete works. It has been published also in French because he is living in France since the exile of the dictatorship. And now there is a big project of translating it into English.
Thanks, Mariana. I didn't know actually that it was being published into English, but I would just like to say that, in fact, after studying 10 years French municipal communism, and by the way, the neighborhood where Sérgio Ferro first inhabited in France, I am now back into my studies in Brazilian modernism. And to me, having gone through, I from the literature, of course, that we are all well acquainted with, I have the feeling that sometimes Mutirão is often taken for granted and equated to self-help, and that this kind of migrations are seldom unpacked, at least within the urban or architectural history, or the history of modern architecture in Brazil, or it's often taken for granted. And I'm very much interested into this the politicization of the discourse of modernism in Brazil. And I found, of course, this is a work in progress, but I found very productive to track these migrations of Mutirão and understanding how specific discourses of sociology or structuralism, even coming from having studied the kind of antagonism between communism and the radical left in France. To me, the Mutirão is a very interesting term to track, especially when you think of architecture, because you understand this broader intellectual history better. So what I try to start with this paper is this close look, but of course is a very disputed term, and one that has it's at the center of very heated debates. So it's always a difficult territory to dig into, but for me it was more or less this idea of the politicization, and I think through Mutirão we can understand very much how this took place among architects. And in addition to that, I mean, I also think that also because I studied in São Paulo, and Brazil is a very centralized country in terms of its history, because it's a continentized it's a continent-sized country. I think Mutirão, if it's also a very interesting entry to understanding, regional implications of modernism and this kind of clash between the rural and the urban.
Yeah, the thing, and also wants just to raise a question, and I give it to you, Nelson. Just I think one of the controversies that perhaps you could try to help us or the group understand is between the sense, and when you track it historically, perhaps it helps. It's the difference between self-help in the sense of survival, of in the political economy, put in terms of a way to also, that Chico de Oliveira reference to Hermínia Maricato was very important, in a way that how in a country with a kind of industrialization process with very low salaries, housing is not part of the cost of social reproduction. So in a critical way, what some people, sociologists would say, and in a good and very elaborate way, Chico de Oliveira, for instance, he was my supervisor, so it was, for me, it's kind of important reference. He would say that it lowered the cost of reproduction of labor, and in the sense it makes possible a kind of capitalism that is kind of very exploratory. But on the other hand, there is the work of Mutirão, which I'm involved in both sides because of the connections with Usina, which it was led by my partner for a long time, Pedro Arendt. And it tries to do it in a way that it's not just about lowering the cost of labor, but in a way of engaging it into an emancipatory project that is critical. It makes criticism against the division of labor in the construction site because of many reasons. So perhaps that's one question that would be interesting. And the other question, if I can raise another question, is about. I was wondering what you think. I don't know if you were in the morning in the keynote conference. I raised the question on Brasilia. I was curious to learn, and now you showed Brasilia, so perhaps for those who were there in the session, I don't know if it was morning, late, afternoon or night for each one of you. For me, it was very early in the morning. But the question was if Brasilia, the super blocks can be called mass housing, considering that most of the population had to resort to exactly as you have shown, not to just kind of modernist architecture, but to self-help and so on. So that was the two questions. Sorry, Nelson.
No, so actually you asked the question that I was going to ask Vanessa. Well, first, Vanessa, thank you so much. It was great. Well, you are very close, but well, now we are all in somewhere in the world. Now, because there was also a debate in the SAL program in 1974 about promoting this idea of auto-construction. And I know that you have already clarified that Mutirão is not necessarily, self-help or indeed, let's say, what I think Maricato called auto-construction, right? And because one of the things that was at stake, as Mariana just mentioned, was this idea of sweat equity as a form of double exploitation. So the people involved in the process was saying, I mean, why in the hell should I, I work the whole day in the factory, I come home tired, and then I still have to allocate part of my day to build my house and then my weekends and all that. So, somebody should take care of this, not me. So I was wondering, and especially, Mariana just mentioned that today, of course, even the projects that Usina is involved with are not necessarily, let's say, exploring this, or not meant to be put forth as a way of further exploiting the low-income groups and all that. But I wonder if that was ever an issue as well in Brazil.
Yeah, I think that's the issue that Mariana just pointed, that Chico de Oliveira, he's already, as far as I understood, my reading of Hermínia Maricato's 1976, this essay that I mentioned, when she she says, you know, perhaps this is not the best term to address, you know, self-help in cities. I think she was trying to respond precisely by this, at least that's how I saw, and that's how I tried to articulate in my paper. She was trying to respond to this romanticized view of solidarity that was kind of being exploited by the institutionalization of Mutirão, the João de Barro program, and you know, as if that implied in the management of resources and decision making, which was not the case. You know, in fact, those programs were relying on cheap labor. And in that essay, she already I had a paragraph on Chico de Oliveira, but I actually removed because I didn't have the time, and it's of course has a broader complexity, and so we had to stick to the 15 minutes. But it's already implied in there, as far as I understood, when she calls into question the term Mutirão, is to deprive from this romantic view of you know, of solidarity, because she was trying to argue that that was a forced solidarity. So I think this is, you know, this idea of unpaid labor, like the, you know, workers having to work, you know, even at their free time to produce their own house, is something that is the core of this criticism. But it's interesting to understand, you know, that even though there is this very moment in which she calls it into question, this is a question that I have, perhaps Mariana can answer, but you know, that the term is still very much used. So I'm not sure, you know, how that, I would like to look closely into that, the very idea of Mutirão, why it's after that, that essay by Herminia, which already encapsulated Chico de Oliveira's criticism, why this very term was not called into question after the opening up of Brazil's democracy, you know. This is a question that I cannot answer, but that's a question that is that I would like to investigate. The very concept, because I think it's this transition from the rural to the urban is very problematic. Yeah, that's a question that I would like to investigate. I'm not sure if Mariana has any hint or someone else.
I would wait until if other people have questions, and perhaps a little bit later.
Sure.
We can also take these questions and try to discuss them in light of the other examples that we saw today, from the 40s through the 90s through the present day. So questions of, you know, when is the burden of housing laid upon the individual or the citizen or the neighbor, or when is that empowerment, when is it exploitation? I mean, that's sort of maybe a running question, or how the individual relates to the community. That's come up again, and what kind of form. And then maybe in the last Chiara and Valentin's presentation, maybe most well, not most clearly, but you try to articulate or search for a role for architects. You were sort of, that's what I heard between the lines or directly, like where does architecture come into this? How can architecture have a role in commoning? And you try to analyze that through a series of projects. But so maybe also trying to discuss the role of the architect in this kind of analysis as well. And I keep coming back to the decommodification question, Nelson, that you said at the outset, which is so central to commoning. I mean, that's what commoning is. It's arguing for decommodification of land, of resources. Is that possible? At what scale is that possible? How does architecture come into it? And some of you have addressed it more explicitly, some less explicitly.
Probably I note one commentary impact about the connotation, the negative connotation of community. And I was thinking about it since I don't remember who said, it's not anymore here. Yeah, about the negative connotation of the word community. And I think if we find some positive faces of this notion in our contemporary times, maybe commoning is a way to put in a more positive dynamic this question of community. You know, how community can take care, can be more resistant, can be more resilient. I think there is, if we look at the trajectory of this word and how it took negative connotation regarding to the role of architect, how architect can take it and in his most positive faces, because architecture should be always positive, no? So commoning is like, oh, maybe there is something to take, to do with, to bring this notion of community in better places than the negative ones. Maybe as an open question.
I think commoning has a much clearer definition, at least as I understand it. It's about a common non-profit management of resources in the long term. And the questions that come up, which came up with Kalkbreite, is like, where do you draw the line? You probably still need a boundary of who's in and who's out, and that's a big question of commoning, right? Is it truly public? Can everybody participate, or do you actually end up having to have some kind of a membership or not? So, but I think commoning is, in that sense, is a form of governance and stewardship. Whereas community is, to me, much broader. And when Ronald Schiffman brought it up, it was from a very particular historical moment when, it was used to define the German nation, which was, eine Volksgemeinschaft. And that was then the connotation it had in Europe, which is, of course, very different than in a US context where the whole system of society is based on the fact that you belong to a community before you belong to society. So I would push back against saying, well, let's use commoning to sort of make community more attractive again, because that's starting to blur too many different things for my taste.
Maybe because I'm thinking about separatism, which is the biggest critic addressing to the manipulation of community, and maybe the heritage and the reception of neighborhood units. The segregative perspective is probably the ghost, the not the hell, but the ghost in the room. So that's why I'm thinking how to continue using community as a tool in housing project, without closing the game in a segregative way. And maybe referring to Ostrom's theory can help to bring some inputs, but also some critics, because also Ostrom attitude or Ostrom perspective can be critical in terms of separatism. That's why I note the question of the neighborhood as a cornerstone, no, of the city nation. I don't know if neighborhood or commoning can be the cornerstone how it can be a cornerstone or an alternative to the city nation. And the Ostrom scheme is bringing maybe an alternative, and that's why it can be criticable, an alternative to, and not an intermediary between people and states. So probably it's here says some pieces.
Can I? No, just would like to comment that I think it was very interesting, the connection between the presentations, how we come from a neighborhood to community and so on, and then we end with Mutirão that has always embedded in a controversial way, in an interesting but controversial way. And I think it's controversial for anyone, even for people who support it, for people who are against it. For anyone, it's a very challenging subject. So I think it was very interesting the way that Vanessa approached it, including all the questions that are important. As for the question that why they use it, I'm not a specialist. No, I'm just. It's part of what I do and my family does. Like we are having now that everyone is working at home, so the meeting about translation Sérgio Ferro is taking part behind this wall. So it's here all the time. And the Mutirão you showed, I was there for the launching part. My kids were there; they were very small, so it's kind of a way that things happen. And also the critics against it. I mean, Maricato was my advisor as a student, and then Chico de Oliveira as well. And so it's everything. But what I could say is that I think it has to do with the importance that the term has to the so-called pro-housing movement. So for them, even if it's criticized, it's part of what's important for them, and it has a material basis in the sense that that's what they do for a survival anyway. So instead of doing it in a way that they get twice exploited, such as Nelson mentioned, it's a concept developed by a sociologist called Lucio Kovaricki about the second expoliation. He would say that, of course, Vanessa knows it, just to mention to the other people. Instead of doing it in an exploratory way, in the sense that people will have to build their own houses in their spare time, so they get exploited at work, and then they have exploited at the living the city as well. Instead of doing that in that way, what they do is kind of just alliance between architects and social movements to do it in a politicized way. Politicized, I don't know if that's the way to say. Politicized way, in which you challenge some important things. And the one important thing is the way that construction companies works. So if you do it in that way, you manage to get like much larger spaces in different locations in the cities, and the typology has to do to the way that people like to live and not the way that's imposed on them. So there are many things that can be done, and so they respond to the criticism of being kind of a secondary way of exploiting by saying that they are doing it in a different way. There is a number of a magazine in which, of a journal, there was this debate was published. I don't know, perhaps you read it, between Usina and Chico de Oliveira. Anyway, that's part of it. But I'm curious to learn what you think about all the discussion on community neighborhoods concerning the Mutirão.
Yeah, this I wouldn't know how to answer, but I was thinking about can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, I'm sorry, my kids arrived and it's going to be a lot of noise, but I was, the idea of a community made me think, when we were discussing throughout the papers, of my previous research topic, which was municipal communism, and how, the word communauté has never been widely used by French communists, from the point of view of the communist leaders, nor even from the point of view of the societies that were organized. And I'm not sure, of the francophone among us, but I have the feeling that in France, communauté is pretty much related to two things: one religious, and the other dimension is pétain. So it's really and this is why I think it's very interesting to unpack. I'm very much what I try to do with this paper. Also, I'm not questioning, the practice of Mutirão. I'm trying to understand the concept, how it evolved, and how it was appropriated and put forward, and how this entailed new appropriations, let's say. So that's why I'm very much, interested in what happened, for example, during the BNH, when these alternative housing projects started to appropriate that language. And then, of course, those who were had the feeling that something was taken from them, they had to kind of reinvent the term and think about this appropriation. So I'm very much, I'm very interested in Kozelek's approach to conceptual history. So the idea of communauté, for example, in France is one that's, it's a very interesting one, because, they refused to use it because it was Vichy. So this is why I'm very interested in unpacking Mutirão, because I do think there's a lot of things to unpack. Not so much about the criticism of the modus operandi, but really about these migrations between language and ideologies.
Yes, no, just mentioning that because to say that that's why it has to do a battle of the terminology, but that's what I think it's interesting in our work.
No,
they responded instead of adopting another term, so that would be a hypothesis for you to work on. I'm not sure.
I think it's a reappropriation, and I do think it has to do with, because Mutirão is so intrinsically related to, the poor that were rural or those who were excluded from land during a colonial, distribution of land, that I think that's why, that's my assumption. That's why they could not give up on the term, even if at some point Emilia said, look, we should not naturalize solidarity. Solidarity has other implications. And I find that article very interesting, the possible architecture.
Could Gaia and Karen, could you try to link the discussions on Mutirão back to neighborhood?
Yeah. I will start from community and from Valentin comment that I think it's also connected to what Mariana and Monica were writing and commenting before. In this history of migration of concept, what I try to look at is the migration from the experiences of the settlement work and the need to measure the social to its institutionalization and codification through the housing program, and the appropriation by architects during the war of this concept. But what I want to say that I think that also thinking at the comment about community that we had before that explained the negative approach and the defiance in the 80s against the notion of communities, and what you were saying, Mariana and Monica, about the connotation of community in the global South. I think I can not only understand this idea of community if rooted in the New Deal culture, in the war context, and in the declination that I proposed of community, and in the federal context of defense housing. Because I think this process of migration finds its root in the previous period. Then it's true that through this idea of community that became a rhetoric during the New Deal, that it cannot be understood, I think, without looking at a long New Deal, at the war context and the federal context. Because there is this idea in the architectural culture to prefigure, envision through neighborhood a post-war planning culture or a post-war architecture. But in fact, I think there is a rupture after the end of the war. And I don't know if you have in mind other examples of real participation during the 40s. I had not before seeing this experience. And also if you look at the tools, these maps, collage, 3D models that inhabitants used in this process of participation, I think that it's something that is the outcome of the New Deal culture and cannot be understood then in the America of the 50s, for instance. This is my idea.
I think it's super interesting to think about, when Vanessa was presenting her paper, I was thinking about what are we building? So in the case of my 3 American examples, we're building, a neighborhood, a community, these these social and political ideas. Sometimes, in the 40s example, especially, we're building a new nation, and we are not the poor in any of these examples. It's addressing middle class and maybe even people with more money. So not building not building the physical houses, which is different. And then thinking about a couple of comparisons. So this show, the MoMA show from 1944, came after, Houses and Housing from 1939, very different words like houses and housing. And that was introducing public housing, the idea of public housing to the United States. And the question of Suzanne's question, the role of the architect. I mean, we've done an analysis looking at words. We could also, Gaia, you were just talking about the visual tools. We can look at the image behind me and notice like what is foregrounded. Like the family is very clear. The architecture is extremely unclear. And this is produced not by the architecture department, but by the publicity arm and the circulation arm of the museum.
So actual architecture takes a back seat. This is more, I would argue, it's about policy, etc. And then, in the 90s, the book says, no, architecture is really important. The design of these affordable housing developments is going to make them good neighbors. They're going to be good for your pocketbook, basically. And then it's funny also because as we speak, there are arguments around the Minneapolis plan because, they achieved the level of detail of getting ready of single family zoning, but architects are yelling because they say the details of the floor area ratio and these different the different details are not allowing the production of new homes that actually will serve the purpose they're meant for. And then I just want to make another point, in the image I showed of the community planning meeting in Minneapolis, we had the people from the plan I described, the neighbors, former neighbors, people with their signs. Next to them was a woman with a sign that said something like, neighborhoods are not the enemy, affordable housing for all. And she was, against the plan. So the difference of the use of neighbor and neighborhood, in this case, one being more physical maybe, and it gets into, discussions of what deserves saving, buildings and physical neighborhoods, or people's lives, basically.
Thank you for trying to tie that up. Our pool of participants is shrinking. The Zoom window is going. So I'm going to have a hard cut at your 7 p.m. Or 8 p.m. It's 1 p.m. here on the East Coast of the US. Final comments or things to get off your chest or questions you want to ask? No.
They're exhausted.
Yes, everyone's exhausted. So I'm going to close it. I thank you all so much for your contributions. They're very well formulated and thought through proposals, and getting at a lot of the key issues of how to build inclusive cities, what role architecture has, what role the individual has, how to decommodify or not. That I think is my central question here, that we should discuss more. I hope you have an excellent dinner or lunch, not alone, off screen, and I look forward to seeing you in some form tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for being a co-host.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.